If I were to ask any of you today to choose whether it would be better to provide substance abuse treatment to alcoholics and addicts or to lock them up in jail, I'm pretty sure the majority of you would say that, of course, we should provide treatment. But there is usually an emphatic but, because alcoholics and addicts often behave in unsavory, sometimes criminal ways. And yes, criminal behaviors should be addressed by the justice system. But if these behaviors are manifestation of the addiction, they won't be corrected by simply locking the individual up. Addiction is a disease, not a choice. It improves with treatment, not punishment. Today, I'd like to challenge the opposing belief that addiction is simply a behavioral problem, and challenge the idea that the Department of Corrections is correcting those that suffer with addiction. Like other mental illnesses, addiction has been identified as a health condition, not a criminal behavioral problem. Although not everyone agrees. Critics insist that addiction is essentially a bad habit formed by poor choices and insufficient willpower. They argue that it is not at all a disease, but a behavioral problem. And how do we respond to bad behavior? With punishment or remediation, depending on how you view prison, because the Department of Correction has become the default treatment provider for these so-called behavioral problems. However, there is extensive scientific evidence that indicates that addiction is a brain disease. From the National Institute of Drug Abuse, in their article, The Science of Drug Abuse and Addiction, The Basics, directly quoting, brain imaging studies from people addicted to drugs show physical changes in the areas of the brain that are critical for judgment, decision-making, learning, memory, and behavioral control. It's those compulsive and destructive behaviors that society is reacting to, labeling the behaviors bad or immoral or criminal without considering them as a result of a mental illness. Speaking of, in general terms, even though mental illness has lost some of its stigma, addiction is the least tolerated. Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health published an article about a study which finds that the public feels much more negatively toward people with drug addiction than those with other mental illness. To quote, "It was found that not only did respondents have significantly more negative opinions about those with drug addiction, but that there were much higher levels of public opposition to policies that might help drug addicts in their recovery." I am sure we are unaware of this bias and how it's hindering the recovery of sick people that need support and help. To me, as a substance abuse counselor, the results from this study are disappointing and frustrating, yet not that surprising. I often hear critical opinions such as, they need to just get themselves together, or they brought this on themselves, or it's a lifestyle choice. But it's not a choice. Just as a person with schizophrenia cannot will the voices away, and the individual with bipolar disorder is not choosing to go into an acute manic episode. Once the disease of addiction has manifested itself, one can no longer just pull him or herself together and stop. Perhaps even more difficult to accept is the chronic nature of addiction. The individuals suffering from the disease and their families often do not get the support and comprehensive services they need to cope with a chronic, relapsing disease. One of the least tolerant of addiction's chronic nature is the justice system. For example, for those on probation for possession of an illegal substance, even when they're court-ordered to get substance abuse treatment, with relapse, their probation is too quickly revoked, and they're sent to prison, where they are often not provided any further treatment. There are also too many people on probation for minor crimes, such as loitering or petty theft, that have their probation revoked for continued use of alcohol or drugs. And again, they're sent to prison and then provided no kind of treatment whatsoever, despite the fact that they were incarcerated directly because they could not stop using alcohol or drugs. This is not just my observation from experience working as a substance abuse counselor. Author Gary Zarkin, in his report titled Study, Replacing Prison Terms with Drug Abuse Treatment Could Save Billions in Criminal Justice Costs, he writes that at least half the state prisoners have a drug or alcohol use problem, and yet only about 10% of them receive treatment. We don't show this same intolerance to relapse with other diseases. Here you see a chart from the National Institute of Drug Abuse comparing relapse rates between drug addiction and other chronic illnesses. Directly quoting from the National Institute of Drug Abuse, relapse rates are similar to those for other well-characterized chronic medical illnesses such as diabetes, hypertension, and asthma, which, like addiction, also have both physiological and behavioral components. To clarify, for the person with hypertension, for example, after diagnosis, they will begin to treat the disease. But unlike addiction, even after medical complications due to patient noncompliance, even after relapse into old behaviors that exacerbate the medical condition, the patient will not be denied further treatment. On the contrary, medical professionals will continue to work with this patient for the rest of his or her life, regularly spending hundreds of thousands of dollars in continued treatment. Another very important factor to consider is that, as a consequence of criminalizing addiction, we are overwhelming the state and federal prisons' capacities nationwide. Quoting from Mortimer Zuckerman's article, Get a Little Less Tough on Crime, since 1980, the prison population has grown 800%, while the country's population has increased by only a third. The origin of this unseemly record is our panic about the explosion of addiction in the early 1980s. He goes on to insist that nobody can pretend any longer that these congested facilities are remedial institutions. Exactly the opposite. More than 40% of ex-convicts return to prison within 3 years of their release. In some states, recidivism rates are closer to 60%. A positive example is the state of Texas, which in 2007, quoting Zuckerman, started shifting nonviolent offenders into alternative treatment rather than hold them in prison. The incarceration rate has fallen nearly 20%, and Texas now has its lowest crime rate since 1968. As a substance abuse counselor, I myself have many examples of admitting new clients who report they've never received treatment while in prison, despite convictions such as felony drunk driving or probation for drug possession revoked because they couldn't stop using their drug, so were then sent to a prison and still did not receive treatment. I used to suspect it was because many of my clients are from a low socioeconomic status and it's harder for them to obtain good legal representation. But apparently no one is exempt. Cameron Douglas, the son of the famous actor Michael Douglas, was sentenced to 5 years imprisonment for drug possession and distribution in 2009. While incarcerated, he was caught with heroin and Suboxone. The latter is a drug to treat opiate addiction. The judge's response was not to order the apparently needed institutional treatment, but to extend the prison sentence by 4.5 years, describing Cameron Douglas's behaviors as reckless, disruptive, and non-compliant. This is from an article by author Maya Solovitz called The Case of Cameron Douglas, Prison is Not Rehab, Say Addiction Experts. In closure, I ask you to try to understand addiction as a disease, not a choice, that improves with treatment, not punishment. If there are criminal behaviors involved that affect public safety, then yes, the criminal justice system does need to intervene. But even then, I ask you to please consider if those behaviors are a manifestation of the disease, we can only hope to change them by addressing the disease through appropriate treatment. And the Department of Corrections is not the indicated provider.